Thank you, Professor Aschheim, for the introduction, and thank you, Ifat, for lending me the opportunity to be a part of this project. And this morning, Dorothea Wirling asked me how I was, and I told her of a dream I had last night, and she suggested that I share it with you. The dream took place here. The room was very messy, and when I was approaching the podium, I noticed that I'm barefoot, my belt is loose, and all the prominent figures sitting here were gradually leaving. So, if you intend to leave, please do so after my talk. And yes, so. Surveying an historian's archive is not an ordinary task, for it involves a multitude of temporal layers: the present day, the period during which the historian researched and published, and the historical chapters covered in his studies. Accordingly, in the case of Walter Grab, we are concerned with 1. Contemporary evaluations of historiographical trends shaped, practiced, and refined during the second half of the 20th century. 2, that is the second layer, the historical conditions dominating the centuries included within the frame of contemporary history, Zeitgeschichte, that is the present as experienced by Grab, which may be accounted for by his contemporaries. And 3, the time span stretched between two revolutions, the French Revolution and the Revolution of 1848, defined by Grab as a failed revolution, however not futile. Accounting for the work of an historian naturally requires us to address several elements of his institutional history, as they formulate a central component in his surrounding habitat, which may turn out decisive for the evaluation of his work as a whole. Grab had indeed become an institutionally minded scholar after having founded the Institute for German History in Tel Aviv University, inaugurated in the fall of 1971, as we heard. The institution's documents, which are kept in the historical archive of the University of Tel Aviv, and attest to Grab's prospects and achievements as an institutional figure, were carefully surveyed by Iris Nahum in her article on Grab and the Minerva Institute for German History. My talk, however, is rested primarily on Grab's personal archive, recently transferred by his family for cataloging and safekeeping in the National Library of Israel as part of a joint research collaboration between the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Center and the Deutsches Literaturarchiv in Marbach. Set at a preliminary stage of research, I do not intend to offer conclusive remarks on Grab's oeuvre, but rather to highlight the contours of his personal and professional identities and their juxtapositions as keys for further evaluation. Having had the privilege to examine the materials in their raw form, stocked in hipped, partially organized folders, I frequently came across this migrant historian's both baldest Viennese cast characteristics, as well as an ample of traces leading to delicate sensibilities and intricate relationships. These were merely offering themselves for examination. Oh, I forgot my presentation. Here we go. So here he is. Walter Grab was born in 1919 in Vienna, shortly before the fall of the monarchy. In 1938, following the Anschluss, he was forced to quit law school and leave the cosmopolitan metropole. He settled with his parents in Palestine, a place he considered first and foremost as a retreat from Nazi persecution. Hence, the very foundations of his new home were cast from the German language and literary legacy, fenced by petite bourgeoisie's social democratic values, which he never abandoned. Due perhaps to his upbringing in a transnational context, the German he possessed preserved its universal qualities, and as such remained for him a cultural emblem, as opposed to an nationalistic or ethnically infused political entity. Thus he could claim in a letter to a German colleague, I quote, "Geistig habe ich in der deutsche Kultur Heimatrecht, das kann mir keiner nehmen," end quote. Shortly after his arrival in Palestine, Grab enrolled at the Hebrew University and began studying history and English literature. Due to the family's acute economic condition, he was forced once again to quit his studies and join his father in the family business. Only in 1958, with 39 years of age, he decided to enroll at the recently founded University of Tel Aviv, where he completed this time his BA in History and Philosophy, and shortly after, he traveled to Hamburg to write his doctoral dissertation under the supervision of the late Fritz Fischer. He returned in 1965 and immediately joined the staff of the History Department at Tel Aviv University, led by the renowned Tzvi Yavitz. It was Charles Bloch who approached Fischer in 1962, asking him to supervise Grab. The latter replied positively, albeit encountering a few difficulties in finding a topic suitable for his unconventional intellectual interests. After suggestions such as to uncover traces of the Napoleon cult in German literature during the turn of the century, or to look into the reception of Tocqueville's secretary Gobineau in Germany were ruled out, Grab decided to dedicate his efforts to the study of democratic currents in Hamburg and Schleswig-Holstein following the French Revolution. In a conversation held in Fischer's office, he reasoned his choice as a result of his will to find out how come the German people, unlike the French, avoided mobilizing their imbued powers for the sake of undermining the privileged order. Referring elsewhere to his impetus, Grab discloses several extra scholarly motivations, blending together both past and present, as well as national consciousness and historical writing. It gave him much pleasure, he recalls, to savor the forgotten and misappropriated Democrats from the hands of the conservative historians, to reassess their achievements and introduce them back into public consciousness. Allgemeine Bewusstsein. The term Deutscher Jakobiner was introduced in the late 1960s by both West and East German historians who devoted themselves to the study of German democratic traditions foregoing the revolution of 1848. During the early 70s, the term was naturalized to an extent it no longer had to be historically justified, at least within the Zunft. That is questionable, of course. It is within this period, as plenty of resources indicate, that Grab became an accredited supplier of Jacobin and radical democratic goods. Considering himself a Marxist, his appeal to revolutionaries demands no further explanation. Fully aware of the implications of his age on his academic career, he rushed to publish his dissertation in 1966, only to begin writing another monograph on the German Jacobins to be published the following year. Within a decade, Grab managed to write and edit 6 additional books and published more than a dozen articles while maintaining prolonged negotiations with Metzler Verlag regarding the publication of a 4-volume series titled Deutsche Revolutionäre Demokraten. At this stage, when approached by a young colleague in late 1974, Grab is referred to as the initiator of the West German research of the Jacobins, a title worth of consideration. In the same year, the Berliner Historische Kommission invited him as a guest of honor to attend a conference devoted to his studies, an occasion he later described to his friend, the writer and dramaturg Uwe Friesel, as the highest point of his career, while sharing his disappointment with the fact that the participation of his East German colleagues was hindered as a result of, and I quote, unbegreiflichen, engherzigen und bürokratischen Bestimmungen. As time went by, echoes of his works were gradually accumulating. Grab kept a copy of each and every one of the hundreds of recessions following the publication of his books, printed in the German press and in academic journals, many of which he listed and dated according to their importance, and together they comprise a significant part of the collection. I wish to draw on this seemingly meaningless materialistic fact to yield the following remarks. First, that Grab apparently enjoyed considerable readership in the German-speaking world, and 2, that it mattered to him a great deal. In order to exercise his influence on public consciousness, as we said, Grab had to pave a historical pathway suitable for the cause. His archive is instructive with regards to reconstructing this unique path, since it enables to locate the fundaments of his historical perception, complementary to the insights gained by reviewing his own works. An abundance of excerpts from his correspondences with colleagues he carefully encircled himself with point to the constant efforts he invested in negotiating an appropriate historical vocabulary with which to treat the subject matter. Traces of the debates over his typologies are found in articles, postscripts, footnotes, as well as the backyard of personal correspondences, where Grab was never hesitant in pulling the sword out of its scabbard. So in a letter to Johann Garber, dated January 1979. Als wichtigste Kritiker fuhren sie Haasis an, dessen Jakobiner Definition sie nicht zitieren, die also vermutlich, muss man annehmen, besser ist als meine. Und dadurch rücken sie mich ins konservativ-rechtsliberale Lager ebenso wie Haasis. Mit keinem Wort gehen sie auf den Versuch Kunz ein, aus den Weizen- und Roggenpreisen einen eigenen Jakobinerbegriff zu entwickeln, wie überhaupt ihre Kritik an Kuhn nicht im Text, sondern in einem Satz, in einem Fußnote erscheint. End quote. In his collegial correspondences, Garber articulates his use of the biographic genre, located at the forefront of his quest to uncover neglected alternatives of the German Sonderweg, to relocate misplaced histories. His protagonists were seen as mediators in an endured process of knowledge transfer, namely the transfer of aufklärische Gedankengut. From an early stage, as his exchange with Karl Ludwig I of the Bayerische Akademie der Wissenschaften indicates, Grab was attracted to the historical, sociological biographies of distinct figures within the circles of German Jacobins, demagogues, revolutionaries, political poets, and late enlighteners, some of whom Jewish. He considered them central in the establishment, for instance, of narratives of continuity and fracture linking democratic traditions of the pre-Napoleon epoch to the nationalists and Deutschtümler of the post-Wiener Congress era. In addition to the previously mentioned fundaments of his historiography, namely the effort to implement a common set of concepts and the digging up of forgotten revolutionaries, one may add Grab's fondness for Germanistic. His belief in the necessity for integrating political history and literary studies is repeatedly demonstrated in his prolonged commitment to expose and highlight political components in the works of 19th century German poets, and especially Heine, which he contemplated restlessly in his exchanges with Germanists such as Alphonse Gluck, René Anglade, and Ingrid Rippmann. In 1970, he co-authored with Uwe Friesel a compilation of historical and political analysis of the works of suppressed poets from the times of the French Revolution until Bismarck's Reich, titled Noch ist Deutschland nicht verloren. Now, if you want to imagine, to understand Grab, think of this title in 1970, his choosing for this title, and the book was widely received. With elements such as typology, biographical writing, and intersections with German classic literature instructing his research, Grab contributed not only to German historiography, but also, and perhaps even more, to the elevation of the Jacobin myth, entwined with an alternate historical path he was eager to uncover. Around the same period, though in a different context, Claude Lévi-Strauss raised the question of when does mythology end and history begins? His answer was that simple opposition between mythology and history, which we are accustomed to make, is not at all a clear-cut one, and that there is an intermediary level. He was not far in believing that in our own societies, history has replaced mythology and fulfills the same function. No one understood this better than Grab. Perhaps he was to think that by following a route merging documented history and literary ethos, he would succeed in avoiding what Strauss regarded as the open system character of historical writing, and thereby preserve the historical chapter of the German Democrats and revolutionaries in the static form of a myth. No doubt, then, Grab ascribed himself a role in the German public sphere. Many historians did so, of course, but in his case, complexities arise as we consider the constant load he was carrying with him when entering this sphere once and again. He was a Viennese Jew, a refugee, a Euro-Asia, as he once regarded himself, a non-Zionist, an Israeli citizen, a radical leftist, an historian. We could imagine these biographical components stamped onto the edges of a Hungarian cube and observe how in a single public engagement of his, the cube transforms itself and the balance shifts towards a certain dimension as the relations between the edges define themselves anew. Allow me to provide you with an example. In October 1969, Immanuel Geist, then a close colleague and student of Fischer, only then this ended, he published a critical essay on the state of Israel in the Junge Kirche, following his stay as the first German guest professor to teach a seminar on German history in Tel Aviv University. Grab, a member of the leftist group Movement for Peace and Security, founded the same year by Yoshua Arieli and others, was nevertheless deeply troubled by the fact that Geist prevented from clearly stressing recognition in Israel raison d'etre. Somehow, this became a central topic in an endured exchange with no other than Gustav Heinemann during his duty as the federal president, kept separately in a sealed packet along with the envelopes. Grab was introduced to President Heinemann by Geist himself, and the two also met in November '69. To President Heinemann, he wrote that the recognition in Israel's sovereignty is a precondition for any accusation regarding violations taking place in the occupied territories. The federal president pulled some strings, and Grab was offered to publish a response. He took the offer. While in fact criticizing Geist from the left, it was actually the voice of Grab the refugee who won the upper hand. Seen from a different angle, the exchange proved successful when considering the reason for which he entered it in the first place. It was during an early sabbatical term, which he was asked by the rector of the Tel Aviv University to utilize in favor of establishing contacts with influential functionaries in West Germany. Grab responses to later controversies, some once again involved Geist, Fischer, and other prominent German figures, were determined by other facets of his figure. I would like to end with the multi-layered construct with which I opened my talk. Dan Diener had suggested that Grab's tireless endeavor to study the upswing and collapse of democratic traditions in the late 18th and 19th century German society was driven by the cataclysmic events of the 20th century. He also stressed that wartime events and their interpretation comprised the very foundations of Grab's later accounts and evaluations as a revolution historian and a Jacobin researcher. To this construct, one may add yet another temporal layer, the present as experienced by Grab. It is within the interplay between this layer and the other two that Grab's historical writing presents itself as a political one. When he published his opus magnum on the history of German Jacobins in 1984, under the title Ein Volk muss seine Freiheit selbst erobern, wary observers from East Germany questioned whether he was hinting at the relations between their people and the government sitting in Moscow. Only that the historian from Tel Aviv, as he stated in a letter, was obliquely referring to the Palestinians. A political historian, then, whose own politea is difficult to discern. Possessing the inherent advantages of the insider gazing from the outside, of he who claims to culturally belong but does not socially partake, I believe his observations on German society of his days are keys to understanding his rhetoric as well as the efficacy of his historiography. They also played a central part in his self-understanding as a double-placed, or rather displaced, historian. Thank you.